Pokemon may be one of the most beloved franchises of all time, but it's also a series that obviously did not put a lot of thought into its lore. The way the lore has been built generation by generation has created so many downright dubious and beautifully bizarre moments, and I want to talk about a lot of those moments today, and also go over the lore in general so it makes sense how those moments fit into the bigger picture. To me, there's really only one place to start when it comes to lore, and that is, of course, the creation myth, as it kind of plays a role in all the other lore. First, there was nothing. Then, there was an egg that would hatch into Arceus, the first Pokemon and being in existence. Existing in a void of nothingness, Arceus then created Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina to govern different aspects of the universe. Dialga's birth created the flow of time, flowing like a vast river. Palkia's birth stabilized space and created the infinite sky, destroying the walls of our world. What's interesting about this information, which comes from Legends Arceus, is it insinuates that Earth, or Poke-Earth or whatever, existed before Palkia and was among the first things Arceus created. Because obviously for the walls of the world to be destroyed, the world has to exist in the first place. Giratina was created to govern antimatter. However, as the shadow to Arceus's light, Giratina was deemed too violent to be left in the universe and was banished to the Distortion world, a world that doesn't follow any rules of the regular universe. No Pokemon exist here aside from Giratina. Time doesn't flow, and space isn't stable. These two worlds can emerge at Spear Pillar, and Cynthia seems to think that Giratina is able to merge them himself if both worlds are in danger, but it might require Dialga and Palkia to be incapacitated as well. Next, Arceus created the Spirit Pokemon, who would give all the beings on Earth specific traits. There is Yuxi, whose birth gave beings the ability to solve problems, as it is the being that governs knowledge. Mesprit, whose birth created emotions, allowing people to feel all from sorrow to joy, and finally Azelf, whose birth gave beings the power to do, giving them the power of willpower. From here, we get into a section of Pokemon lore that's lacking information, which is the births of the rest of the legendary Pokemon and just kind of Pokemon in general. There are two main theories about this era of progression. The first is that Arceus created a lot of the remaining legendaries to shape the world. Pokemon like Kyogre, Groudon, Regigigas, and others were created by Arceus, as well as Mew, which became the progenitor of all regular Pokemon. However, this theory is contradicted by the Pokédex entries for Primal Groudon and Kyogre, as they state that the duo was formed from deep within the earth, which insinuates that they both just kind of formed of their own volition, not of Arceus's. The other theory is that the final Pokemon Arceus created was Mew, and then Mew evolved in a Darwinian manner into every other Pokemon over time as it needed to, or maybe just because it wanted to at times. This theory has some ground to stand on because Mew is considered the ancestor of all Pokemon, and it has the DNA of every Pokemon within it. It's also worth mentioning that a number of Pokédex entries imply that there are multiple Mew, and while they are exceedingly rare nowadays, that might not have always been the case, which kind of supports this theory, as it means that over time, Mews evolved into more and more varieties of Pokemon, depleting the population of Mews. It is also worth mentioning now that a lot of legendary Pokemon are not singular in the Pokemon universe, despite them being singular in pretty much every Pokemon game. This might even be the case for Arceus, as it's said they shaped the universe with their 1,000 arms, even though it has no arms, leading to the conclusion that each Arceus is just one of these arms. If anyone else has any theories about what happened in this time frame, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear them. For now though, we're going to be moving on to the shaping of Earth. After this, at some point, Groudon and Kyogre formed deep within the earth and created the ocean and the land masses and immediately started beefing. This threw the surrounding areas into chaos, and it was then that Rayquaza appeared and got them to chill, sending them both into a slumber deep within their respective elements for a long time. Shortly after these events, Regigigas awoke and shaped the continents. His movements were likely what inadvertently created Heatran, as it was shifts in the earth that created the environment for it to form. Around the same time, Arceus conducted one last act, as they created the Adamant Crystal, Lustrous Orb, and Greasious Core before falling into a slumber in its own realm. And that's basically the Pokemon creation myth. As a myth, it is of course somewhat up to interpretation, but that's the general idea. So from here, I want to get into the specific lore that each region has. Let's get started with Kanto, which has two pieces of lore I want to cover. The first is the creation of Mewtwo. After discovering Mew in South America, the Pokemon was brought back to Kanto, where it gave birth. This new Pokemon was called Mewtwo, and it was subjected to vicious experimentation, specifically with its DNA, which was arranged and recombined over and over again to try and make the Pokemon as powerful as possible. Ultimately, this goal was achieved, and its battling abilities were raised to the ultimate level. But shortly after, Mewtwo escaped human containment with little effort and retreated to Cerulean Cave, where it stayed until the events of the main series. These experiments were likely conducted at the Cinnabar Laboratory, which can be deduced since these journals are found in the Cinnabar Manor, and the Cinnabar Laboratory was also the lab where Porygon was created, meaning it has plenty of experience with Pokemon experimentation. The brutal scientists that conducted these experiments were likely Mr. Fuji, as he was the founder of the lab back when he went by Dr. Fuji, and also Blaine, since he is obviously a seasoned scientist and there aren't really any other locations in Kanto or Johto that he could practice at. The other piece of lore is more of a fan theory than anything, but it is kind of insinuated that Kanto was once involved in a war of some sort. The only primary source of this information is Lieutenant Surge, who states that his electric-type Pokemon protected him during the war. But there's also a ton of circumstantial evidence that is spread throughout the region as well, like how there are relatively few middle-aged men in Kanto. They're all either old as hell or on the young side. Many people take this lack of men as evidence of a war that took place a number of years ago, which decimated the male population, or at least the part of the population that was eligible for enlistment. It's not much evidence, but it's what we've got. We don't have any real information on who this war was fought with, but many fans seem to think it was some sort of civil war or war of annexation with Johto, because the two regions do have a lot in common, like sharing a Pokemon League. But personally, I think it was Unova, or some other United States-based region. I have one main reason for thinking this. Lieutenant Surge is referred to as an American by many people throughout the game, and I can't really imagine a reason Surge would be stationed in a war-ravaged Kanto unless it was some sort of occupation, but that's probably a little bit far-fetched. Get it? Anyway, let's move on to Johto. In Johto, there is one giant, obvious piece of lore: the burning of the Brass Tower. A number of years ago, the Brass Tower was struck by lightning, setting it on fire and burning it to the ground. Within were 3 Pokemon that became trapped in the blaze and died, before being resurrected by Ho-Oh as the 3 legendary beasts: Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. While it is widely speculated that the 3 Pokemon that died in this tower were Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon, thanks to their shared typings and vague resemblances, this is never actually confirmed. In-game, the people of Ecruteak believe the beasts emerged as water, fire, and electric types to resemble the storm that burnt down the tower, with Raikou representing the initial lightning strike, Entei representing the fire that burned down the tower, and Suicune representing the rain of the storm that ultimately put out the fire. Johto is also home to the oldest known language in the Pokemon universe, that being the Unknown-inspired alphabet. Interestingly, it's not actually clear which came first in this case. While it might seem obvious that the Unknown came first and that the humans copied their alphabet, we also see Pokemon evolve because of human action, such as the Clink and Roly-Poly evolution lines. So it could be that the Unknown evolved around this language from humans. Despite being featured in multiple Pokemon games and being some of the oldest ruins in Pokemon, they're still mostly a mystery to us. We know some ancient civilization built them and left messages about the importance of Pokemon to whoever might study these ruins, but that's kind of it. And lastly, I should at least mention Celebi. Celebi is the mythical Pokemon that guards Ilex Forest in every time period. There isn't much other information on its role in Johto though, so I guess it's time that we return to Hoenn. We already covered a good bit of Hoenn's history during the creation myth part of this video, as a big part of what we know about Hoenn's history is just Groudon and Kyogre beefing a few times. But there is more to Hoenn than just those 2 bozos, as we have to talk about the Regis. Regi Regigigas created the original 3 golems about 10,000 years prior to the events of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Those were, of course, Regirock, Regice, and Registeel. However, shortly after, all 4 of these golems were sealed away by humans who feared their power. About 2,000 years before Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, there was another beef session. At this time, the Earth was overflowing with natural energy, which made Groudon and Kyogre wake up and start rampaging as they do. Once again, Rayquaza shuts them up, and as a result, the Draconid people start worshipping it as the savior of their culture. We don't know exactly what caused the Earth to overflow with natural energy at this time, but there was a large and continuous meteor shower around the same time, so maybe that had something to do with it. Oh, and also Hoenn has been to the moon. This is one of those moments where the Pokemon world and our world overlap in a weird way, because in the Moss Deep Space Center, there is a guy who says he bought a color TV just to watch the moon landing, which happened on July 20th, 1969, the same exact day it happened in real life. Does this mean that people like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin also exist in the Pokemon world? Does NASA exist? And if so, does that mean that the United States exist in the Pokemon world? We don't really know, but it's kind of crazy regardless. Hoenn has 2 mythical Pokemon, but unlike Mew and Celebi, neither Jirachi or Deoxys play a role in the region's lore. In Jirachi's case, that's because all it does is sleep for like 1,000 years at a time, and Deoxys isn't even from Earth, and as far as I can tell, the Delta episode is the very first time it is encountered in the Pokemon canon, which I know is a loose term, but still. So let's move on to the region that started it all, Sinnoh. Much like Hoenn, a lot of Sinnoh's lore is simply the creation myth, but that's not all of it. There are still some loose ends to tie up, like Regigigas. After moving the continents, Regigigas created the aforementioned golems of ice, steel, and rock, and around the same-ish time, he also created Regieleki and Regidraco. These 2 were made of energy rather than physical materials like the original 3. This is interesting to me because it makes you wonder just how strong Regigigas is. I mean, being able to create living things out of rock, steel, and ice is crazy enough as it is, but being able to manifest and shape the physical embodiments of energies is crazy. Evidently, the ancient people of the Pokemon world understood the strength Regigigas possessed, because shortly after forming the golems, it was sealed away in the Snow Point Temple. How they managed to seal it away at all, we don't know, but they also managed to seal away the other 5 golems, so it seemed they had some sort of methodology. About 9,000 years after the sealing of Regigigas, the people of Hisui, the precursor to Sinnoh, started worshipping Arceus under the name Almighty Sinnoh. The events of Legends Arceus are a topic I am conflicted about covering, because they are technically both lore and the events of a main game. So I'm going to cover the lore of Legends Arceus that we haven't already covered and then move on. Let's start with the Ancient Hero. The Ancient Hero is a mysterious figure that befriends 10 Pokemon, those being the 10 regional variants from the game, and then collected all 18 plates scattered around the region in order to meet Arceus. Upon meeting Arceus, he bested the Pokemon in battle, earning its respect. Arceus then blessed the human and his Pokemon, and they became the protectors of Hisui, going as far as defeating Giratina and sending it back to the Distortion world. This dude is basically just a stand-in for the main protagonist in ancient times, but he is the reason we have the Ride and Noble Pokemon, so I thought he was at least worth mentioning. Another piece of mythology present in Hisui is that of the genies, specifically Enamorus and Landorus. These 2 arrived in Hisui slightly after a tough winter, and their presence blessed the lands of Hisui, which brought life and growable land to the region. There isn't really mention of Tornadus or Thunderous though, so we won't be talking about them now. Lastly, at some point in history, the Diamond and Pearl clans crossed the ocean and settled in Hisui, before beefing over whether the almighty Sinnoh was Dialga or Palkia, even though it was neither. Yeah, classic Pokemon plotline right there. Unova. From Unova onward is where the lore starts to get pretty weird, as each region starts to have more specialized lore rather than general lore like Gens 1, 3, and 4. One of my favorite examples of this is that Conkeldurr taught humans how to make concrete about 2,000 years ago. This might not sound insane, but it kind of is. See, in the real world, the invention of reinforced concrete was one of the largest catalysts for the Industrial Revolution. It allowed people to build bigger and faster and completely changed the way we build to this day. So the fact that this dude likely played a role in creating the Pokemon world we see today on a scale comparable to some legendary Pokemon Pokemon is insane to me. Another big part of the lore of Unova is of course the original dragon that created the Tau Trio. Long before the events of Black and White, Unova was created by two brothers who united the people of the land using a single dragon Pokemon. This led to both of them becoming kings of the region, but their peace and cooperation wouldn't last too long, as they began to argue over their beliefs. The older brother cared most about truth, and the younger brother cared most about ideals. This disagreement led to the single dragon Pokemon splitting into Reshiram, who sided with the older brother, and Zekrom, who sided with the younger. The brothers then fought, but neither dragon could come out victorious, so they agreed that there was no correct side between truth and ideals. At some point after this, Dragon Spiral Tower was built, and it seems the DNA splicers were created around this time as well. The tower would then hold Reshiram or Zekrom, depending on the game that you're playing, until the events of the main story. Then there's Kyurem. Kyurem is a bit weird because there is conflicting information on its origin. Many people believe that Kyurem is essentially the leftovers of the original dragon, which is why it confused with Zekrom and Reshiram. And while this is a valid theory, there's also an old legend in Lakusona Town that states the dragon came to Earth in an icy meteor, meaning it's not related to the original dragon at all. Personally, I like to think it's the leftovers of the original dragon because it just makes more sense in my mind, but both opinions are valid. Unova is also kind of unique because it has two sub-legendary trios. There's the Genies and the Swords of Justice. To me, the Swords of Justice are the more interesting trio, so we're gonna cover them first. The Swords of Justice appear whenever Pokemon seem to be threatened by human expansion. Virizion protects them from threats, Terrakion creates a safe path for the Pokemon, and Cobalion leads them to safety. During one of these rescue missions, they found Keldeo in the ashes of a forest, and they took it into their ranks. It then grew quickly, surpassing the Swords of Justice, and then disappeared. Its reasons for disappearing are not known to us yet. Additionally, these three went as far as fighting against humans to protect innocent Pokemon, even fending them off a number of times, which is pretty impressive if you ask me. It's also pretty telling that these three are present in Unova considering its rapid urbanization. They are definitely not treating the wildlife all that well. And that brings us to the Genies, everybody's favorite legendary trio that definitely did not bend competitive Pokemon around them. The most infamous of the Genies was undoubtedly Landorus, who also seems to be the most important in lore. A legend states that long ago, Landorus punished Thundurus and Tornadus for decimating the land around the Abundant Shrine with harsh storm conditions. Apparently, Thundurus and Tornadus have had a fierce rivalry that has existed for hundreds of years, with Landorus having to quell these conflicts time and time again. Landorus later traveled to Hisui with Enamorus, as we covered earlier. Interestingly, all the Genies have two forms, the Incarnate and Therian forms. The Therian forms are used when the Pokemon travel between regions, and the Incarnate ones are for when they are staying in a region. And now we move in to Kalos. Kalos is, unfortunately, one of the regions we know the least about, because at the time of recording, there are only 2 games set there, with a third on its way. This means its lore is fairly thin, but it does still have one of the coolest pieces of lore around in the Ultimate Weapon. The Ultimate Weapon was a weapon of mass destruction, capable of generating infinite energy and discharging it. It was originally built by AZ after his beloved Floette died in a war, as he wanted a way to bring it back to life. While the weapon did succeed in bringing his Floette back to life, it also came at the cost of the lives of many Pokemon, and accidentally made AZ and Floette immortal. This wasn't the end of the weapon's usage though, as AZ sought revenge on those that killed Floette in the first place. So he activated the weapon a second time, this time using it to destroy both sides of the war. While this did bring peace to Kalos, AZ's struggles were not over. His Floette eventually learned that over 60 Pokemon were sacrificed to bring it back to life. Horrified by this massacre, it abandoned AZ, and AZ then left Kalos to search for it, wandering aimlessly. During his absence, the weapon was buried deep underground by AZ's brother to prevent it from being used again, even though it can't be activated without a key that AZ has. So with him wandering the world, it wouldn't be able to be activated even if it was found. That is, until his return in X and Y. The Ultimate Weapon might be the origin of the Mega Stones, as theorized by Professor Sycamore, who believes the blast from the weapon irradiated evolution stones, transforming them. What's kind of crazy about the Ultimate Weapon is that it was likely made pre-industrialization, as we established in the Unova section. The progress of the world of Pokemon is undoubtedly pretty different from that of our own, despite how similar the worlds end up being. I know it's a kid's video game and this kind of stuff probably isn't taken into account, but still. Next is Alola. This is another region with some pretty wacky lore. It all starts a few hundred years before the events of the main games, when Necrozma stole the light from Ultra Megalopolis. Crazy name for a city, by the way. The citizens that lived there tried to fight Necrozma to recover the stolen light, and in the battle, they injured the Pokemon, which caused pieces of its body to rain down on different worlds. This includes Alola, which is how Z crystals were formed. Later, Solgaleo or Lunala came to Alola through an Ultra wormhole. The Tapu Quartet, the guardians of Alola, saw these two powerful Pokemon as potential threats and engaged in battle with them, but were ultimately defeated. Solgaleo or Lunala then offered the Tapus Tapunium Z as a reward for their efforts. Afterwards, the other legendary Pokemon would appear and they would create a new Cosmog together. Then they would leave the new Pokemon in the care of the Tapus. At a later point in time, Necrozma came through the wormhole itself and stole the light of the region, before getting a hold of Solgaleo or Lunala and turning them into their Duskmane or Dawnwing forms. This sparked another conflict where the Alolan royalty requested the Tapus battle Necrozma. They were able to defeat it and restore the region's light, with the help of a young trainer using Z powers. This ordeal created the island challenge that Alola became known for, and later the Alolan royalty ordered the burning of all books related to Necrozma for some reason. Many years after this, a scientist built Magearna, and many years after that, the Aether Foundation was formed. They studied Ultra Beasts, and during their research rediscovered Ultra Wormholes, Cosmog, and Nihilego. However, the founder of the Foundation, Mon, would disappear during a mission where they attempted to connect to a Ultra Wormhole, leaving behind just a weakened Cosmog. His disappearance left Lusamine in charge of the Aether Foundation and mentally unstable. The Foundation would then start research on the Beast Killer project and would create Pokemon known as Type Full, which was based on Arceus, literally trying to recreate God. The experiments were not successful though, as the Type Full Pokemon rejected the Arceus system, manufactured by the Arceus Laboratories in Galar. As such, they were given control masks and renamed Type Null before being cryogenically frozen. Interestingly, Mon does return to Alola at some point later and starts running Pokemon Pelago, although all his memories have been erased by whatever ordeal he went through. This is the region that kind of made me realize just how many forces of evil in Pokemon want to control a god to accomplish their goals. I wonder if there's a reason this is such a repetitive theme. Nah, probably not. Anyway, let's move in to the land of Galar. Galar has a lot less lore than any of the preceding regions. Basically, 20,000 years ago, a meteorite with Eternatus in it fell in Galar. Then, 3,000 years prior to the events of Sword and Shield, Eternatus awoke and created a black storm that covered all of Galar. This day would be known as the darkest day in Galar's history. It was ultimately stopped by two boys with Zacian and Zamazenta. When Eternatus was destroyed, it shattered and pieces of it flew off across the region, creating the resources for Dynamax bands. At a later date, Calyrex was found injured in the Crown Tundra. It was taken in by humans as they cared for it until it fully recovered. As thanks for this action, Calyrex turned the fields of the tundra into lands that could grow crops, and was then worshipped as the king of bountiful harvests. Later, Calyrex saved his people from Glastrier or Spectrier and forced the beast to become its steed. But much like the story of Zacian and Zamazenta, Calyrex was slowly forgotten over time, resulting in it losing its power, and even its horse would abandon it. As far as I can tell, that's pretty much all the lore we have for Galar. One aspect of Galar's lore that I found interesting though was the timeline of Eternatus' awakening. It awoke 3,000 years prior to the main story, which was about the same time the ultimate weapon was used in Kalos. According to Eternatus' Pokedex entry, it absorbs energy from Galar to stay alive, so it could be possible that the enormous energy generated and released from the ultimate weapon was the cause for Eternatus' awakening as well. That's just speculation though. And finally is Paldea. And let me tell you, this region has some old lore, stretching back about 2 million years, which was when the Area Zero underdepths were formed by earthquakes. It was also around this time that Terapagos got trapped underground as a result of the seismic activity, causing the species to largely go extinct. It would be another million years before anything else notable happened in the region though, as that is when the crater that would become Area Zero would form. As far as I can tell, we still don't know what formed this crater. It could have have been more natural seismic activity, or it could have been a meteor. We do know, however, that it was not the ultimate weapon of Kalos, as that would not be created for another 997,000 years, and as we stated earlier, the weapon landed in Kalos, not Paldea. About 2,000 years before the story of Scarlet and Violet, the great Paldean Empire rose to power and ruled Paldea. They declared a great age of exploration by sending exploration parties into Area Zero in search of treasure. Some of these expeditions claimed to see a planet floating in space in Area Zero, which was the stellar form of Terapagos. But these expeditions would lead to the Empire's downfall, as after 1,000 years of failed expeditions, the Empire fell into decline. At some point during the Empire's reign, a merchant from the Far East gave the king 4 treasures: a vessel, a broken sword, a set of wood tablets, and a set of beads. These were, of course, the Treasures of Ruin quartets, which earned their name after they went on rampages as a result of the king's greed. Ultimately, the Pokemon were sealed away in shrines by strong Pokemon trainers. 800 years prior to the main events of the story, the Academy central to Scarlet and Violet was founded, and the Paldea region unified with a few of its neighboring countries to become the Paldea region we know. Sometime after that, an exploration team claimed to be the first people to reach the bottom of Area Zero. One of these members was Heath, who wrote the Scarlet or Violet book depending on which game you're playing. He and his team then planted Herba Mystica around Paldea in an attempt to get it to grow agriculturally. However, this led to the creation of the Titan Pokemon we fight in-game, so they gave up on the effort. About 60 years before the main story, the first terrestrialized Pokemon appeared in Area Zero, and later the Pokemon professors discovered that the energy emanating from the crystals in Area Zero, which was being produced by Terapagos, was the cause of terrestrialization. The professor then invented the Terra Orb and shared it with others around the region. And finally, just 1 year before the events of Scarlet and Violet, the Pokemon professors created a time machine, which they used to accidentally bring 2 Koraidon or Miraidon into the modern age, which ended up killing the professor and releasing Paradox Pokemon into Area Zero. And that's all of it, I think. I know there are a few legendary Pokemon I didn't cover, but that's because they either don't contribute to the lore of the region, or we have no idea how they actually came to be, so I didn't feel they were necessary to include in the video. If you want me to talk about more of the legendary Pokemon, let me know in the comments down below. I would not mind making another video on them. That's it for this video though, so thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you've made it all the way to the end. You obviously like the content, and it would really mean a lot to me. I'll be back with another video in the next couple of weeks, so I'll see you then.